The working class was the key to Bolshevik success, both inside and outside of Russia. Lenin feared that a communist Russia would not be able to survive without more advanced countries going communist as well. In 1918, we saw Trotsky try to stir up communist revolution in the German army, and fail. The Germans continued their invasion of Russia. That and the Civil War convinced Lenin to move the capital from Petrograd to Moscow, which was deeper in Russian territory and less open to attack. It continues to be Russia's capital today. The German army may not have wanted a communist uprising, but German workers and sailors were ripe for it. They organized a massive revolution between 1918 and 1919, helping knock Germany out of World War I. To the Bolsheviks in Russia, it seemed like they would finally have a valuable communist ally. But the German Revolution failed, thanks to opposition from liberals and soldiers. This was a low point for the Bolsheviks, but things were about to get much worse. Back in 1917, Russian sailors at the Kronstadt naval base near Petrograd were enthusiastic supporters of the Bolsheviks. Bolshevik leaders considered them heroes and brothers. In 1921, they revolted against the Bolshevik government. They disliked the Bolsheviks taking power for themselves and going back on their promise of all power to the Soviets. Only the Red Army and Cheka crushed the Kronstadt rebellion. It was an embarrassment for the Bolsheviks, proof that they didn't represent all of the proletariat. This wasn't the only rebellion the Bolsheviks had to contend with either. As we've seen, the government was taking food from the peasants to feed the cities and the army. In 1920, peasants in the town of Tambov organized a massive rebellion. 50,000 Red Army soldiers were needed to crush it. The rebellions in Tambov and Kronstadt and the failure of Germany's communist revolution convinced Lenin that Russia's communist leaders were on their own. They were encircled by enemies both outside and inside of Russia, what Lenin called capitalist encirclement. Lenin's response to capitalist encirclement was to enforce strict discipline in the Bolshevik Party. The party would debate Russia's problems amongst themselves, then make decisions about how to solve those problems. No other political party was allowed to debate. Even then, Bolsheviks could only debate within the parameters dictated by Lenin. Once decisions were reached, Bolsheviks fanned out across the country to make sure cities and towns obeyed. As we've seen, most cities and towns had Soviets, leaders elected by the people of that area. By the early 1920s, those Soviets followed the dictates of the Bolshevik Party. As time went on, Bolsheviks ensured only they would be elected to Soviets in the first place. It was clear that Communist Russia would be a one-party state. All power to the Soviets, as long as they answered to the Bolsheviks. One last issue remained for the Bolshevik Party: Russia's nationalities. Russia was a diverse empire, with Russians, Ukrainians, Poles, Tatars, Lithuanians, and others spread throughout. When the Tsars were in power, they forced these nationalities to use the Russian language and accept Russian culture. The Bolsheviks supported self-determination, the right of different nationalities to rule themselves during the revolution. That's why many of these nationalities supported the Bolsheviks. Many believed that self-determination meant independence. But as time went on, it was clear that this was not what the Bolsheviks meant. To the Bolsheviks, national identity was kind of fake. It didn't matter what language you spoke. Working people everywhere were part of the same class. Once the communist revolution took over the world, there would be no more national identities. But reality didn't work that way. In 1920, the Red Army invaded Poland hoping to stir up communist revolution there. The Poles had no interest in this. To them, this Red Army was the same as every other Russian army that invaded many times before. The only difference was this army fought for communism and not the Tsar. The Bolsheviks slowly realized that national identity still mattered. People weren't willing to trade their ancient cultures for some newfangled idea of communism, especially communism with a Russian accent. Lenin was forced to compromise. He knew he couldn't let Russia's national groups become independent. But he also promised them self-determination. Lenin ensured that each nationality would be able to speak their own language and hold on to much of their culture. He'd even let them elect their own Soviets, as long as the people they elected were reliably communist. To reflect these changes, he changed Russia's name to the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, also known as the Soviet Union. This made it seem like each nationality had the freedom to do its own thing. In reality, this was not the case. Yes, they had more freedom to speak their own languages and practice their own customs, but they still answered to a government that operated out of Russia, this time with a capital in Moscow instead of Petrograd. The USSR would operate until 1991, at which point these national groups split into several smaller countries. Putin's invasion of Ukraine is part of a much longer history of the Ukrainian people trying to assert their national identity against Russian power, whether that power was exercised by czars, communist dictators, or Vladimir Putin. The Russian Revolution was one of the earth-shattering events of the 20th century. It is up there with the French Revolution as one of the most important political revolutions of all time. Not only did it leave a mark on Eastern Europe, it established communism as a philosophy that had to be reckoned with in the future.
Stalin, wearing a military greatcoat and peaked cap, arrives to review the greatest demonstration of Soviet strength since the revolution in 1917. Accompanied by his commissars, the Iron Dictator takes up a position at the base of Lenin's tomb, from where he sees a parade of Russia's military might, a modern army, complete in every branch.